Hello, we are Team 110, and welcome to our presentation for the 2018 College Fiscal Challenge. The United States economy currently faces serious long-term risk due to a rapidly expanding debt-to-GDP ratio. It currently sits at 77%, but the Congressional Budget Office projects it to double to nearly 150% over the next 30 years. According to the World Bank, the United States suffers a 17 basis point decrease in annual growth for each percentage point that the debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 77%. Consequently, we face impaired future growth levels for the next 3 decades. Furthermore, federal interest payments accelerate as the level of debt grows. They constitute a larger portion of government spending relative to the entire budget. In the current low-tax, high-spending environment, these risks constrain our ability to pay for any unexpected national expense, such as a war, natural disaster, or financial crisis, without heavy borrowing and cutting social spending. To mitigate these long-term risks, we urge the government to take swift action. Our policy proposals will satisfy 3 broad criteria: the restoration of taxes to historical averages, the streamlining of government spending, and supporting productivity. The first of these is to restore taxes through a tax overhaul and a carbon tax. The second is the streamlining of government spending, which includes cuts to defense spending, policies to combat the opioid epidemic, and Social Security overhaul. The third is productivity support, which includes immigration and education reform. Our goals are to restore fiscal stability and strengthen output.
Our first policy is a tax overhaul focusing on simplicity for Americans while remaining efficient to collect and manage. According to CNN, there is currently more than a $450 billion tax gap between taxes that are owed but are not paid. To solve this problem, while creating a simpler and more efficient tax system, we propose shifting the majority of federal tax income from income taxes to a 10% value-added tax. Value-added taxes are a percentage-based tax collected at each stage of the production process, and the government would be able to efficiently manage collections through blockchain technology. Income taxes will be completely eliminated for individuals with less than $50,000 in income and couples filing jointly with household income under $100,000. All taxes above these thresholds will be taxed at 20%. This will decrease total income tax returns to $30 million from $140 million, making higher income tax returns easier to manage and audit when necessary. Additionally, we propose creating an income redistribution program to combat the regressive nature of a value-added tax, such as prepaid cash cards distributed to lower-income Americans. This would allow qualifying Americans to pay for necessities in an easy-to-distribute method with high liquidity. Additional revenue will be raised through reducing the collections department of the IRS, as total income tax returns will decrease by $110 million. This will save over $2 billion annually. As a step towards simplicity, while increasing revenue, we propose increasing the capital gains tax to 20% to match the income tax rate. Collectively, these policies simplify the process of each American's tax returns and the IRS's process of collecting revenue. From CBO projections, our policies will increase GDP by 0.6% and decrease debt by 0.7%. The overhaul yields a net revenue increase of $106 billion in 2018 and will decrease the 2047 debt-to-GDP ratio by 2 percentage points to 148% overall. While this may seem like a small change, it gives the government much simpler and straightforward tools for raising revenue in the future. Our second policy is an investment in public education. We propose initiating bonuses from federal grants to create a more exaggerated pay scale for teachers. On average, the middle third of K-12 teachers will receive a $5,000 annual bonus, and the top third will receive a $12,500 bonus. Moving up from a bracket comes with increased responsibility and a raise. Teachers in the top 2 brackets will be responsible for mentoring, evaluating, and ensuring quality in the first bracket, who will hypothetically be just entering the workforce. This investment will raise the desirability of teaching positions, thus increasing the supply of potential workers, leading to increased education quality. Increased education quality leads to innovation and greater efficiency throughout the entire economy, thus increasing total factor productivity. With increasing teacher strikes across the country, this investment comes at a much-needed time. Many teachers are struggling to live on their current salary, and this results in lower quality education for students who will become the future labor force. According to the Educational Testing Service, higher quality education is proven to help reduce cyclical poverty, which many Americans face. Based on a paper from Sebastian de Souza, and given this policy's implementation, we should expect GDP to increase by an average of 2.2% each year. In contrast, CBO data shows GDP increasing each year by an average of 1.9%. Our renewed growth rate will increase GDP by 6.9% and debt by 2.2% from CBO projections. Overall, our education policy will decrease the 2047 debt-to-GDP ratio by 6 percentage points, down to 142% overall.
The United States currently faces opioid and heroin epidemics like never before. Addiction and overdose are growing by the thousands each year, with 2016 accounting for 42,000 overdose deaths involving opioids. What you see in front of you is a heat map that exhibits the highest geographic concentrations of overdoses. It is a national concern because this not only kills Americans at an unprecedented rate, but also becomes an expensive epidemic for cities and municipalities to pay for. The CDC reports that this problem costs our government about $75 billion annually. Furthermore, there are large swaths of potential workers sitting out of the workforce. According to Alan Kruger, these epidemics drag down collective productivity and reduce national income. In response, we propose the national government implements safe injection sites. These are facilities where citizens may walk in and safely use any drug. These sites are equipped with a full medical staff, as well as drugs such as naloxone to handle medical emergencies and prevent death from overdose. They ought to be implemented in close proximity to the homes of high concentration areas and built in proportion to the nearby population, with larger populations demanding facilities with more booths. It is worth noting that research shows that these facilities do not increase drug addiction or drug-related crime. A decade's worth of data from Vancouver shows that safe injection sites do not depreciate property value as well. Furthermore, we intend to gradually cure this epidemic by reducing the supply of general opioids in public hands. This will happen through the complete prohibition of advertisement of prescription-strength opioid painkillers. Finally, we mandate every state to become a triplicate state. All opioid prescriptions are written on 3 copies, one held by the prescribing doctor, one held by the pharmacist, and one held by a state agency that watches for overprescribing practices. Through this conglomerate of treatment and cure policies, we expect to gradually rid this country of the opioid crisis, heavily reducing government spending on health, social, energy, and inpatient care costs. We project 80% elimination of the opioid crisis by 2047 and factored in the partial restoration of drug addicts to the workforce. We project this policy to decrease the national debt by 2.9% from CBO projections. Overall, this policy is projected to lower the debt-to-GDP ratio by 4 percentage points to 138%.
Our next proposal concerns immigration. We propose that the United States pursue a policy similar to that in Senate Bill 744 and grant legal status to around 11 million of the undocumented immigrants already in the United States who are currently working, and increase the availability of work visas, which will be granted primarily to those who graduate from U.S. colleges with degrees in the sciences, technology, engineering, or mathematics. Our estimates suggest that reform will boost GDP, increase productivity, and eventually increase real wages. Estimates from the CBO suggest that legalization will increase revenues about twice as much as it will increase costs. These immigrants will now be subject to income tax, generating a $14.7 billion increase in tax revenue annually. Furthermore, many employer-employee transactions will no longer be under the table, and although real wages will initially fall, within 10 years, they will be higher than projected values. This increase in wages can be attributed to an increase in productivity, since this proposal expands opportunities for entrepreneurs and investors and those with STEM degrees to work in the United States. GDP will also rise relative to projected values, at an average of $17 billion per year, since this proposal will increase the size of the labor force and the size of the population in the United States, who will in turn demand more goods and services, and therefore increase the demand for labor. Additionally, the immigrant population is much younger on average than the American population. These immigrants will therefore be able to pay into the Social Security system. Furthermore, the increase in real wages will allow these immigrants to pay more into the system, thereby adding much-needed funds into the program. Revamping our immigration system will increase the GDP by 21% and the debt by 9%. We project our immigration policy to reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio by 13 percentage points to 125% overall. Our next proposal concerns Social Security. Due to the retirement of the baby boomers, lower birth rates, and greater life expectancies, estimates suggest Social Security funds will become insolvent in 2034. We propose 2 different options: changing the COLA and raising the taxable maximum. First, we propose to change the COLA, or the cost of living adjustment, from the CPIW to the chain CPI. The COLA measures the changes in spending patterns that result from changes in inflation. Due to substitution bias, which fails to account for how consumers change their spending patterns to maximize spending power, and small sample size, we believe the CPIW overstates the true rise in the cost of living, and therefore that the chain CPI is a more accurate measurement. The chain CPI grows on average about 0.25 percentage points lower each year, so its effects will compound over time. This policy will decrease outlays by a combined $1,625 billion by 2047, and therefore decrease the federal debt. We also propose to raise the share of taxable income to 90% of all earnings, or to annual earnings up to $245,000. Currently, annual earnings up to $118,500, or 83% of total earnings, are taxed. Although at the inception of the program, 92% of all earnings were taxed, this percentage of earnings has decreased in the past decade because earnings for the highest paid workers have grown faster than average earnings. Under this policy, those who will now have to increase their annual contributions to Social Security will also see an increase in benefits after retirement. Furthermore, this will make Social Security tax less regressive. Although many worry about its effects on working incentives, our analysis suggests this would only affect people on the margins, or those earning near $245,000 annually. This policy will decrease outlays by a combined $4,188 billion in 2047. Changing the CPI and raising the taxable maximum will not affect GDP, but they will decrease debt by 0.7% from the CBO projections. Taken together, these policies will reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio by 1 percentage point to 124% by 2047.
Our next policy is to implement a national carbon tax. The inspiration for the carbon tax came from the Climate Leadership Council. The idea is to start with a $40 per metric ton tax that increases at a rate of 2% above inflation for 10 years, for a final tax rate of roughly $49. This generates $175 billion in revenue the first year and reaches $190 billion before declining to account for decreasing carbon dependence. The plan ultimately nets approximately $5.5 trillion in revenue over 30 years. One of the negative policy ramifications of a carbon tax is that the increase in energy and gas prices for consumers has a regressive effect. To counter this, the plan includes a $500 per household dividend, which will initially cost roughly $8 billion and increase to account for population growth. This figure is relatively small compared to the overall revenue increase. The carbon tax will initially decrease GDP, but will increase GDP 4% from the CBO projections in the long run. Furthermore, debt will decrease 22% from the CBO projections. The effect of the carbon tax in terms of the overall platform is to reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 28 percentage points to an overall ratio of 96%.
U.S. defense spending constitutes the largest portion of annual federal spending. The latest Senate deal sets the 2018 Department of Defense budget at $640 billion, $100 billion over the 2011 budget caps. Data from the Brookings Institute and Cato Institute show current spending significantly higher than necessary in order to deal with current and future threats against the United States. Current U.S. strategy can be described as primacy. It is categorized as having near unrivaled power in all facets of war and overwhelming first strike capabilities. Our proposal is to shift U.S. grand strategy away from primacy and toward restraint. The Department of Defense would reanalyze credible threats to national security and remove redundant spending. These reductions would be under three broad categories: personnel reduction, acquisition reduction, and nuclear decommission. Currently, there are no large-scale agitating forces that are poised to fight in direct combat with the United States. These personnel cuts follow the same force reductions DoD is currently using for longer periods of time. With current primacy policies, there is no cohesive strategic direction when choosing how to handle real-world threats. As a result, Department of Defense is currently bloated with acquisition and research programs that are over budget and overlapping in strategic scope. Switching to a grand strategy of restraint would reduce redundancy in acquisition and strategic choice. Lastly, our current nuclear arsenal is far larger than necessary as a means of deterrent. A grand strategy of restraint would considerably reduce the nuclear arsenal and drastically cut modernization programs as a result. These changes would reduce GDP from CBO projections by 0.6%, while reducing debt to GDP an additional 23% through 2047.
We project our policies to lower the debt to GDP ratio to 73% through the year 2047. This ratio is near the requested 75%, and we believe that we can heavily mitigate the risks posed by a high debt to GDP ratio. Without our recommendations, the United States faces fiscal pressure in the forms of lower GDP growth and higher government spending. Our economy, which is experiencing a prolonged period of growth, risks squeezing future spending programs from the public, and this effect will be exacerbated by any unforeseen natural disaster, military conflict, or other crisis. Therefore, it is imperative that we enact these policies now. This was a presentation from Team 110. Thank you for your time.